So, welcome to lecture 2 on existentialist ethics. If you haven't watched lecture 1 yet, go watch that video first. This isn't going to make sense to you if you don't.
So in this second lecture, we're going to go beyond radical choice. And basically, we're going to offer an objection to Jean-Paul Sartre's ultimate framework of ethics by way of talking about Charles Taylor's theory on desire, evaluation, and responsibility. We'll go over some key points from Sartre, and we'll offer some counterpoints from Charles Taylor's philosophy regarding strong and weak evaluation. We'll get into some of the terms now. So just to give you a roadmap of where we're headed, first we're going to talk about Sartre's ethics. We're just going to go over that quickly as a refresher. Then we're going to talk about second-order desires, defining the uniquely human capacity to desire certain desires. And it sounds a little bit murky, but I think we'll get there. It's not super hard, but it's a little confusing, so pay close attention to that. In section 3, we'll talk about weak versus strong evaluation, arbitrary choices versus qualitative moral reflection, which is a different thing entirely. And Charles Taylor is going to make some really good points about what makes us agents involves qualitative moral reflection or strong evaluation. We'll get into that. Section 4 is going to get into the depth of responsibility, how qualitative reflection forms the basis of true agency. And in section 5, we're going to talk about the critique of radical choice. Taylor's idea that Sartre's existentialist framework ultimately doesn't capture the depth of the existential aspect of being an ethical agent. And so Sartre's theory is going to be too thin, or it's going to fail on its own terms once we add in some further reflection about what we humans have to do as radical choosers. So even if you take radical choice very seriously, as Charles Taylor does, he's not throwing Sartre's theory out whole cloth, but he's saying that Sartre's theory is radically incomplete, and we'll get into that now. So before we get into things, I just want to recall some key points from lecture 1. First, man is condemned to be free. That the human condition is defined by a radical freedom apart from any sort of design plan, so we must choose alone how we live. There's nothing about us that we don't make of ourselves. We are the composite object of our choices and our actions in the world. That's just what it means to be a subject. 2, that universal moral responsibility exists because our choices example for other people what their choices can look like. And so providing a picture to other people is something that our choices, that's the effect that our choices have, and so that sort of paints a moral picture for other people. And then 3, acting in good faith or bad faith, acting authentically versus acting inauthentically. If we deny our freedom, if maybe we cave to the anguish that we feel because we have no design plan or no real rules to take the responsibility from us, shifting responsibility is a form of self-deception and therefore a kind of moral wrong. It's an error. It's wrong to do that. It's bad to do that. We should act in good faith because we do bear that responsibility whether or not we acknowledge it. And so if we act in good faith, we take up in a real and courageous way the responsibility that we have as people or as moral agents. So in the first section, we're going to talk about second-order desires, what separates humans from animals. There's a number of things that separate humans from animals, but one conspicuous feature of humans is that we can think about thinking, and that's second-order thoughts. So I can think about the fact that I think about things. I can think about chicken and then go, I think about chicken a lot. That's a second-order thought because it's a thought about a thought. And arguably animals can't make that kind of a cognitive move. The neuroscience is probably more complicated than I could let on, but from what I understand, that's a separating feature of humans and animals, that animals can't do second-order cognition. They can't think about their thoughts. Additionally, it doesn't seem like they can desire certain things. I can desire to sit around and doom scroll on Instagram and goof off all day as opposed to write my thesis or make lectures for you guys. I could desire to do that, while I could also, desire to be a good professor, desire to be a good lecturer, desire to get the sort of accolades that you get when you work really hard on your presentations or you work really hard on your research. I desire both of those things. But a second order desire would be, in order for me to achieve some of my desires and not others, I need to set boundaries for myself. If I'm going to doom scroll on Instagram for a little while, I need to put a timer on. I need to make sure that I'm appropriately using my time. Or if I'm going to do my lectures, I can't be a workaholic. I need to give myself rest because I won't do good work ultimately. So I need to make sure that I do that. So I have to desire those things. And that's a second order desire, the way a second order thought is a thought about a thought. It's kind of a mouthful. Hopefully that's not too confusing, but we'll talk about a little bit more of this. We'll sort of unpack these concepts as we go further. So the evaluation of desires, and this mainly comes from Charles Taylor, but I'll try to give you some sketches of it, and then we'll get into some more specific theories as we move on, or more specific material as we move on. But I'm just sort of setting the stage and clearing the ground for what the arguments that are going to come up. Okay, so Charles Taylor's notion of evaluating desires. A weak evaluator and a strong evaluator, and weak evaluations versus strong evaluations. So Sartre doesn't make this distinction, but Taylor does, and it's a pretty important distinction, so I'm going to try and unpack it for you. Weak evaluation involves weighing options and preferences primarily for convenience and compatibility. I'm trying to gel my desires together. Like I said before, I desire to be a good lecturer, but I also desire to sit around sometimes, right? How do I gel these things together? Well, I can schedule my daily activities so that I can get a little bit of both. I don't have to sit around all day and eat potato chips just because I crave that sort of thing. I can also make sure that I go out of my way to eat healthy foods. That's a way to gel my desires together so that I can maintain health, but also not be hyper strict about my diet to the point where it makes me miserable. That's an example of a weak evaluation. Okay, the primary focus is simply how to make your desires compatible with each other. For example, wanting to be in better shape coordinated with wanting to eat unhealthy foods. I like unhealthy foods sometimes, but I also realize that it's bad for me. I'll have high cholesterol. But these are weak evaluations. They're more base level, trying to make sure that my desires are in tune with one another. Now, there's a stronger version of this that Taylor unpacks, and it's called strong evaluation. And so a qualitative reflection on the nature of my desires, where I ask myself, are my desires noble or base? What kind of desires do I have? What kind of desires should I have? Strong evaluations take a step back to survey the kind of desires that I should want. Okay? The ability adds profound depth to my character and shapes the kind of person that I aspire to be. It's a very big difference between somebody who could only weakly evaluate versus someone who can strongly evaluate. Somebody who can qualitatively adjudicate between the sort of desires they have because of what sort of person they want to be. That's a very mature way to think about yourself, and it's something that we're faced with as adults. Children probably only weakly evaluate pretty much. They want ice cream, but they also want to stay up all night, but they also want to not be tired in the morning and cranky. Like, they want those things, but it's difficult. They're sort of managing that. But as adults, and as we become more sophisticated agents, we start to find that we have strong evaluations that we can and should make. We can ask what we should want, what kind of desires we want, given what kind of person we want to be. It's a very different kind of desiring. It's a very sophisticated way to manage your life. And we have this ability as moral agents, or as agents, but also as moral agents. And it's going to come to the foreground when we start to consider how these strong evaluations and our ability to do strong evaluations affect what our ethical and moral choices. And like I said, Sartre doesn't have this. He doesn't really make room for this. This is like a new dimension, like a new depth to the kind of ethics that start with a radical choice. And so we'll get into that a little bit more. Human depth and responsibility is really what comes to the foreground here. So humans uniquely possess second-order desires, allowing us to evaluate not just what we want, but the quality of what we want, or what sort of person we are given that we want X, Y, and Z, okay? So the capacity for strong evaluation is ultimately what makes humans responsible for who they are. It's kind of a buzzword here. Sartre and the existentialist ethicists wanted to make sure that we take our responsibility. We don't shift our responsibility. But if we bring this new thing in, that we have the capacity for strong evaluation, it adds a new dimension of what we are in fact responsible for. And arguably, it's sort of what makes a human agent a mature agent rather than an immature agent. A strong evaluation and the ability to manage your life, knowing that you could have better and worse desires. That sort of thing is what that sort of choice set is what mature agents deal with. And so there's something deeper about the responsibility here that sort of comes to the foreground, which the existentialist ethicists that have come before, the French existentialists like Sartre, they really didn't have any room for. They didn't make conceptual space for this. So, oh, there's a double on here. But we'll move to the next thing. We'll talk a little bit more about Taylor's critique of Sartre now. This is sort of stage setting. I want to make sure that you understand that it's like, if we have this ability to evaluate our desires based on what sort of person we want to be, based on whether our desires are noble or base, something that we want to be and someone who we want to be like, we can do this. And that is involved in what it means to be a mature agent, a mature chooser, somebody who takes full responsibility for their life, which is arguably something Sartre was pushing pretty hard for, but he didn't notice this, or he didn't add this to his theory, and that's going to be an issue. So that's going to come up in Taylor's critique proper. So we'll get into that next. So now we're going to talk about Charles Taylor's specific critique of Sartre, given what we've just said a moment ago. We have this ability to be strong evaluators. It's something that is definitely or arguably involved in human responsibility, and not something that Sartre's theory made room for. And that's arguably something Sartre's missing. So we'll get into that presently. So one thing I mentioned in the discussion question last time we talked was choice and chance. I talked about the difference between choice and chance and how they're kind of opposites. Choosing, especially meaningful choice, is going to involve more than just random chance. A meaningful choice is something more than random chance. It's not just a dice roll. Meaningful choice is something different than that. So Sartre's theory has it that we're abandoned by God. We have no design plan. That is something that a tenet of the theory that Sartre is pushing. But without God, there's no pre-established human nature, and therefore values are solely derived from human agency and its exercise. That's something that Sartre believes. As he said, man did not create himself, yet is nevertheless at liberty, and from the moment he's thrown into the world, he's responsible for everything he does. So man is just responsible for everything he does. And you are nothing, if you remember that what Sartre says, you're nothing more than the sum of the things that you've done. This is a tenet of existentialism. But Taylor rebuts this by saying a genuine choice requires a pull of alternatives. So a genuine moral choice involves having or noticing or being sensitive to a genuine pull of alternatives, something inherently drawing us to one option over another. So if no pre-existing values guide us, as Sartre argues, then all moral choices are really just random selection. But if all choice is merely chance, why call that agency? Agency is something where a person decides. They choose one thing over the other. They choose to do one thing over the other. Like in the student's dilemma. The student was being pulled by two sets of duties that were conflicting. They were mutually exclusive. Should I go fight for France, or should I stay home to protect and care for my grieving mother and not risk my own life and risk giving her even more grief? What do I do? Do I fight for what I think is correct? Do I avenge my family members, or do I go home and take care of my ailing mother? Which should I do? That being presented with those two choices, that is something that's more than just, I wouldn't just flip a coin to figure out what I did there. I would have to really choose in order for that to be meaningful. But that's part of what it means to be an agent, more than just flipping a coin and going one way or the other. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but there's another problem that I'm going to get into inherently. There's actually several serious flaws in the radical choice program that Sartre pushes, and Taylor's going to push on three different problems. So the three main flaws that Taylor points out in the radical choice theory pushed by Sartre are as follows. So with Sartre's theory, there's no inherent pull on any of the choices. Morality bottoms out in choice. All there is choice. You can't have guidelines because guidelines involve trying to shift responsibility. Ultimately, as we've talked about in the last lecture, everything just comes down to choice. All of the moral fiber and the moral substance of any sort of choice that seems like it's moral, it's all just going to come from the choice that you make. That's all there is to it. There can't be guidelines like the categorical imperative or the Sermon on the Mount or the Ten Commandments. It's not about your internal feelings on the matter or anything that like your gut emotions or anything like that. That's not going to make your choice for you, and it's not involved or it's not derived from getting advice. You can't just go out to some person for advice because the advisor is going to have their own preconceived notions of how you should make a choice. Ultimately, you're just trying to shift responsibility. That's what you're doing with those with those actions. And so Sartre wants to argue there's nothing except choice. That's all there is. The bottom floor of this sort of ethics is just radical choice. You just have to choose to invent. What Taylor points out is that choosing involves picking from pre-existing values which pull us towards certain choices rather than others. If it's just desire, then it's mere weak evaluation. That's not really what mature agents do. But on top of that, the student's dilemma doesn't make any sense. Why is it that the student has to choose between protecting his mother or fighting for France rather than protecting his mother and then drinking Mai Tais all day on the beach? Why isn't that a equally weighty moral choice? If there's no inherent pull that comes from the content of the choices, that comes from the actual choices themselves, not just the chooser, then morality makes no sense. It would be just as morally weighty to decide to go drink on a beach. And I'll talk about that in the next slide a little bit more. So I'll move to the next one now. If choice is just chance, then that sort of expunges agency, and therefore it expunges responsibility. This is the second problem. So choosing without valuation threatens to reduce choice to mere chance. It's a coin flip. Genuine responsibility necessitates agency, which random chance lacks. You can't have an agent who's just random. Rocks do things randomly. You can't even say rocks do them. To say something is done randomly is to say something wasn't done by the thing doing it. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but the idea is that chance and agency seem incompatible, and it's certainly incompatible to say you have to take responsibility for your life. All of your choices and all the moral fabric and fiber of your choices are fully in the choices that you make. The alternatives are not what matters. What matters is the choice. But that makes everything into just random chances. And where's the agency in that? Where is the responsibility being taken in that? It doesn't make any sense of what it means to be responsible, but it's something that Sartre is heavily dependent on to make his theory make sense. And so there's an incoherence that's built right in the middle of his theory. Moreover, there's a good faith paradox. Okay, so if you remember, good faith and bad faith choices have to do with fully taking responsibility for the things that you do. So realizing that I can't get advice, I can't go to the Sermon on the Mount, I can't go to the categorical imperative, I can't go to external guidelines or appeal to other things. It's just my choice that makes an action moral. That's all there is to it. But Sartre claims that we should make good faith choices. But notice, we should make good faith choices? Should is a valuation. So if all morality is only in your choices, then why can I say I should make good faith choices? It's itself, that's an unchosen value. It's there to regulate your choices, fundamentally violating his own premises. If all the moral weight is in the choice, but you should make good faith choices, then why, if I make a bad faith choice on purpose, aren't I being moral and immoral at the same time? It's a paradox. There's an incoherence at the heart of this. The good faith paradox says, on the one hand, Sartre says, you got to make good faith choices, you have to be authentic, that's the way that you're moral. On the other hand, it says, there is nothing except your choice that makes it moral or immoral. So the fact that I choose to be a bad faith actor in the world, that's not immoral any more than just deciding to be a good faith actor. So you can't say that it's only choice. There's a paradox at the bottom of all that. That was kind of a drink from a fire hose. Go back and rewatch this, listen to it again. Hopefully you'll get it. Hopefully I'm not being too fast or being obscure here. The point is that there are pretty major problems with the internal structuring of Sartre's notion that, and the existentialist, the wider existentialist ethicists, that morality is found only in choice. Because if it does that, if you hold to that in this flat-footed kind of way, you have no inherent pull on the moral choices that form your moral dilemmas. It seems like chance and agency are kind of the same thing, and you have a good faith paradox, where on the one hand you say you should act in good faith, and that also anything you do is what you should do because you invented the choice. You're the ultimate moral agent. Your choice is the only thing that make your actions moral. There's a paradox at the center of that. Hope that makes sense to you. Let's move on. So I mentioned before that there's no inherent moral pull on the choices on Sartre's view. And I think that it's important to really, really hammer this point, because there is something courageous about taking responsibility for your choices. There is something important about realizing that when we are the sole arbiter of our choice, we're responsible for our choices. Now, if you're an atheist and you believe that we're truly abandoned, that there's no design plan, it's going to be more difficult for me to talk to you about that because I'm not an atheist. I don't take the fact that we're abandoned by God as a starting point for my moral dilemmas, and neither does Charles Taylor, incidentally. But that's not why I think that there's a problem with Sartre's overall programmatic. In fact, Sartre's overall system, it makes some really good points. But I want to insist that the problem here is not just that, like, Sartre's saying something that's controversial, or that he's got a fundamental tenet of faith that's different than my own, and so I'm rejecting him. I want to insist that there's something seriously wrong with Sartre's view that all morality and all action is imbued with morality because of our choices. There's something wrong with this, and for the main reason that it smuggles in non-chosen values, and it's something that Charles Taylor hammers him for. So Sartre claims that all values are from choices. Taylor counters Sartre's theory by arguing that he implicitly relies on unchosen values, especially in the student's dilemma, which I mentioned a bit earlier, but I'm going to rehash it a little bit more slowly here. Sartre fails to see that the student's dilemma involves a strong, unchosen moral claim. It's implicit in the choice set. Okay? Fighting for freedom versus caring for your grieving mother already exert a powerful pull on you. Okay? If, on the other hand, all values were created by choice alone, then choosing between caring for your grieving mother and eating ice cream cones all day long would be equally momentous, because the moral weight and fiber are just in the choices. That's all there is to it. Genuine moral dilemmas presuppose unchosen, weighty values. There's an inherent pull. There's a moral pull on certain choices rather than others. But if all moral just cashed out in choices, then eating ice cream all day and abandoning your mother is like, well, my choice is just in what I invent. It's just what I choose. That's obviously untrue. It's a wild claim. It's an absurdity that I think Sartre's view can't handle, and Taylor is right to point this out. So Taylor posits an alternative framework, which I've mentioned a little bit. I've mentioned some of the tenets of, with strong evaluation and the sort of what it counts to be a mature agent. How do you sort of regulate desires with this qualitative approach? Basically, Taylor's alternative framework preserves self-responsibility without just bottoming out purely in choice, and we'll see how he does that. So one thing to notice about Taylor's alternative framework is that he still has to explain where the pull comes from on certain moral choices. Why a moral dilemma between fighting for France, helping your mother, that's a real moral dilemma, but drinking all day on a beach and abandoning your mother and the French military to fight the Nazis without him, that's also like, why is that not part of the moral dilemma? Why is that not part of some moral trilemma, which has three things as a choice? Do I fight for France? Do I help my mother? Or do I just abandon both and become an alcoholic? It's like, that third choice is clearly not the right sort of choice to count as part of a moral conundrum that you're stuck in. And so how does Taylor's alternative framework handle this? Because if you remember, Sartre argued that guidelines all fail because theories can't definitively guide us. No moral rules, no sense of right and wrong, and no seeking advice can really guide us, because we have conflicting duties that demand choices that have interpretations, and that interpretation always involves just you making the choice on your own. Ultimately, it's going to be your interpretation, and even if you slant the interpretation by going with some, like allowing your choice to be made by some feelings that you're having, or seeking advice from people who have their own slanted opinions, you're only making that choice in bad faith. And so Sartre might push back here and say, well, where are you going to get your choices from? Why do you think that you understand where morals get their inherent weight from? It can't just be straightforward appeal to guidelines, because there's been objections advanced against that. So what does Charles Taylor say? Well, Taylor says that we have an inchoate sense of worth, okay, that we just have by way of being agents. And what he means by that is That fundamental evaluations are not just chosen, they're articulations of our sense of what is inherently worthy. Now, inchoate is a weird word. What it just means is it's fuzzy, it's out of focus. Like, imagine a camera that hasn't quite come into focus yet. That's an inchoate sense of worth. So we know what things are worthwhile, but it's fuzzy. We're not fully apprised of this. We're not aware of it the way we're aware of other sorts of choices that are clear and straightforward. This underlying sense is often fuzzy and difficult, and it involves interpretation, but it acts as an interpretative framework, not a fixed rule book that guides us towards some higher and more fulfilled way of being. It acts as like a guide. We have a conscience. We have other things that guide us in this way, but it's not this immediate, obvious, A, or B choice. It's fuzzy, and we can articulate it, but it requires grappling. It requires striving and interpretation. That's what Sartre doesn't. Sartre hasn't made any conceptual room for this, and this is what Taylor says actually makes for the real moral weight of choices. We have a sense of what is objectively valuable that's just built into what it means to be a human agent. We can tell that drinking on a beach all day is not the same moral weight. It's not of the same moral weight than fighting for France or helping your mother. They're just not in the same class. How can we tell? Well, we have an inchoate sense. We have a fuzzy sense of moral worth that we know what it is, but it's difficult to articulate. So we can't always codify it perfectly into rules. Yes, Sartre's right about that. You can't do that. But we can use them as helpful guides that drive us or push us towards being more in tune with what is objectively valuable. And so you might ask, well, how does this all work? How do we employ this inchoate sense of value? Well, there's three main parts. There's interpretation, there's asking questions, and then there's the actual process of evaluation. So true responsibility lies in actively interpreting and articulating our fuzzy values rather than merely pulling them straight out of a rule book. It doesn't work that way. But we don't choose them based on nothing, like Sartre says either. It's not like random choices that we make. We don't just throw ourselves into the future. As Sartre says in Existentialism is Humanism, we don't throw ourselves into choices. That would be random, ultimately. And so that's not really agentive either. We want to be responsible moral agents. And so that involves interpreting and articulating our fuzzy values, being able to enter into conversation about this, whether it's just with our own reflective thinking or with other moral agents that are helping us. So the advice seeking for Taylor is going to be he doesn't think that advice seeking is in bad faith. But another thing we need to do is question. Interpretation is nearly always open to questions, so we must constantly ask ourselves if we've truly understood what is essential to our identity as moral and responsible agents. We have to be very careful that we don't just say, yeah, we have this inchoate sense, full stop. No, we are, because it's inchoate, because it's fuzzy and it's difficult to interpret. It involves us working on it. We have to actually take a long, hard look at some of the choices that we're making, some of the ways that we evaluate, and we have to make sure that we're being responsible moral agents. We have to do this actively. This is not a one and done thing. It's not like we can just all codify it into rules. We need to actually, this is our sense of how to make choices, or what's morally valuable, what's truly morally worthy. Those things are going to be they're open to question, and we have to be able to receive and respond to those questions appropriately. That's one thing that's involved in being a fully mature moral agent. Thirdly, we have to evaluate. Strong evaluators constantly call their values into pressure. This is a recursive process of questioning, constitutively questioning deep levels of our character. And so we constantly have to bring these things into the foreground and ask ourselves, is this the sort of person that I am, and that, or is the sort of person I am the sort of person that I want to be when I'm facing something like a moral dilemma? Now, I want to take a step back and say that it's not as if what's being recommended here is that, like, you don't do anything anymore, all you do is sit around and think about ethics. I don't think that's what's being recommended. That's not really a charitable interpretation of what Charles Taylor's saying. What he is saying is that it's involved in being a moral agent that we're willing to take a step back and be able to strongly evaluate, to be able to take up that burden of responsibility when we are faced with moral choices and moral dilemmas and weighty moral decisions. We have to be able to do this. We have to know what we're doing and sort of know, okay, I'm going to go look. I'm going to go try to sense what's inherently valuable, and I'm going to try and make a principled choice based on that. I'm going to be an evaluator. I'm going to be a mature moral agent. I'm going to take a close look and a reflective look at what I'm going to, at the choices that I'm making, to try to make sure that I'm in tune with what is objectively valuable. I can't, there's something deeply immature about just throwing yourself into one option or another when the choice is extremely weighty. Something like joining the military. We would think of a person as being extremely irresponsible if they didn't really know much about it and they just heard some random advertisement and thought, yeah, this will be a cool, fun life. I'll go do that. It's like, no, you didn't make that choice appropriately. You need to be circumspect about a decision like that. That doesn't mean that being in the military or joining the military is not valuable or something like that. But it's a bad choice if you made it on basically no, with no reasons involved, and you hadn't taken a step back to reflect, is this the sort of person that I want to be? Now, I spent years in the United States military, and I'm very glad for my choice, but I did not make that choice in a very informed way. And I look back on that with some regret. I didn't make that decision very well. I'm so glad the structure it provided me, the discipline it provided me, was invaluable. I needed it more than I ever knew, and God led me to do that. That was a very it ultimately was an amazing choice, but I made it for bad reasons at the time. I didn't like where I was living. I didn't like the people I was around, and I sort of just threw myself into that lifestyle, into that fraught and very difficult and dangerous job. And it ultimately paid off, but that wasn't a good choice on my part. I was being an immature or a non-circumspect evaluator. I wasn't making that choice appropriately, and it was a very dangerous choice in that regard, because it could have gone very differently, or maybe it could have. I think that ultimately it was a good choice, and I'm glad that I did it, and I'm glad that that happened to me. But I want to insist that what Charles Taylor is talking about here is not something distant and ivory tower and highfalutin reasoning. It's not like that. This is something that we all will face. These are choices that we are all going to be party to at some point in our lives. And what Charles Taylor is suggesting here is that it's really important to make sure that you realize the weight of choice, or the moral weight of our choices is really important to recognize. But in order to grapple with that appropriately, we have to be able to interpret, to question, and to evaluate. We need to be able to do these things so that when those choices come to the foreground, we are capable of approaching them like mature moral agents. It's a really important thing to understand, and I think it's very relevant to what we, the sort of choices that we're faced with throughout our lives. So what I really want to point out in discussion is that this is kind of a sketchy argument. I feel like it's very clear to me how this works. I felt very, very strongly about this when I first read Charles Taylor's paper, and I first read Existentialism as Humanism, and I looked at them both. I was like, wow, I really think that Taylor's got something going here. He critiques Sartre's view really, really well, and he points out something that Sartre misses, and something that maybe Kant or other moral philosophers haven't been able to point out, that it's like, it is true that we need to take subjectivity, choice making seriously, but we also have to take, and the responsibility that comes with, we need to take that seriously, but we also have to take into consideration that there are real inherent moral values that are difficult to articulate. They're sometimes, there's something about them that makes them difficult to articulate inherently. It's the messiness of life combined with the fact that we know that certain things are right and wrong and certain things are true and false about our moral judgments. And I think that that's a fair way of putting this. So, something to discuss. If values are always up to question, maybe what Taylor wants to say is that we always need to be questioning. That's part of what makes us good agents, is that we can always question our values, and this makes them deeply interpretive. How can we avoid self-deception or relativism? Because maybe Sartre wants to come back and say, well, this might just be a form of self-deception. Or how do we find out whether it's just like, it's all relativism. It's just all, we can always interpolate or negotiate new standards, and so come up with ways to scurry out of any moral, obvious moral choices that we need to make. What anchors the obvious values, the preferences for happiness over misery, or loving your neighbor as yourself rather than hating your neighbor? Like, what grounds those preferences, if Taylor is correct ultimately? I think obviously Sartre would say there's nothing that grounds them, it's just your choices. But Taylor's criticism is really strong, and I think that Taylor's criticism is decisive against Sartre. But there's still open questions about what makes Taylor's framework, what gives integrity to his framework, besides the fact that he's acknowledging and steering between these rocks and acknowledging choices, but also acknowledging that the rule book is not fully articulate to us. So that's what I'd like you to discuss, or at least think about in the coming lectures, or in the coming discussion questions. Think about what it is to steer between those rocks of avoiding self-deception and bad faith, avoiding the fact that we can make choices which are disacknowledging of our responsibility, and sort of shunting our responsibility for our choices away from ourselves. And the idea of relativism, the idea that it's just like, well, it's just up to anybody can sort of negotiate their way into believing anything, such that you could even negotiate yourself into believing that misery is better than happiness. And so we want to avoid that. But does Taylor's theory have that kind of elasticity to it? Is it flexible enough to start to bend itself into a completely wild shape, which is just that relativism, or complete and utter self-deception? So that's pretty much the whole lecture, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Hope it hasn't been boring or too out there for you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Look forward to hearing from you.